I mean, as I said, the main focus is China, and I might graduate a bit to Indo-US relations as well. But let's begin with China. Give me a broad picture view of what's going on, especially in light of Rajnath Singh meeting his Chinese counterpart.
If you look at the current status of the India-China bilateral relationship, I think the word brittle and tense, they come to mind. Because what happened in Galwan in the middle of June, I think we have to view the India-China bilateral as pre-Galwan and post-Galwan. In Galwan, the Indian Army lost 20 soldiers, including a colonel, because of what India had then characterized as a premeditated intrusion by China across the line of actual control in the Ladakh area. And that for a variety of reasons, where the Indian tactical presence was a bit thin, they took advantage. And basically, it was a breach of trust, because between India and China, there have been a series of agreements, 4 of them to be precise, from 1993 onwards, when the first one was signed between then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and the Chinese president at the time, Jiang Zemin. The essence was that they would work towards maintaining peace and tranquility across this 4,000 odd kilometer undefined border, a territorial dispute for which both countries had gone to a limited war, a skirmish as they call it now, in October 1962. So this was positive that Jiang Zemin and Rao could arrive at an agreement. It was subsequently refined, improved for 20 odd years, from 1993, I would say, till as recently as 2020. That makes it 27 years. Mm-hmm. And there used to be a lot of surprise globally that here are 2 large countries, Asian neighbors, large militaries. In many places, the militaries were proximate in terms of their patrolling. But not a shot was fired in anger. I remember I accompanied Mr. George Fernandez to China when he was defense minister. Mm-hmm. And in his speech then, when he spoke at the National Defense University, he made this observation with a fair amount of satisfaction, that there was some political kind of agreement between the 2 nations that the militaries would operate under a certain medium. It was based on trust. And I think the great Indian sort of disappointment is they see the Chinese action in Galwan as a betrayal of that trust. And the fact that you lose a colonel and 20 soldiers is a very, very significant, I would say, event for any military. And therefore, I often say that we have to see India-China now as pre-Galwan, post-Galwan. And from the middle of June to where we are now, it's soon going to be 3 months when we come to mid-September. Both sides, the militaries are now making their positions more robust for the winter, a sign that China is not moving back, which is what India has been urging it to do, to restore the status quo pre-Galwan. Whereas they have consolidated their position along the LAC towards and beyond the claim line that India had demarcated, had indicated for the last 27 years. And with the latest development, which is that over the weekend, the Indian Army, along the south bank of the Pangong Lake, if you look at the map, you'll get an idea, have improved their tactical position. So, which is to say that very much on the Indian side, they have not done anything similar to what China did. They have only fortified their own positions so that they could foil any possible Chinese movement towards the Indian side. And it's against this backdrop now, I would say that the bilateral is brittle, because China has not given any indication militarily that they would accept the Indian expectation or move towards it. And I think it's interesting that when the SCO meeting, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, is going on in Moscow, we understand that the Chinese defense minister had indicated that he would like to have a meeting with Mr. Rajnath Singh, the Indian defense minister. And even as we speak, I gather that in a short while from now, it is likely that the two defense ministers will meet. And I think this is a positive signal sign, but we have to wait for the outcome of that meeting before we arrive at any kind of conclusion about where we are headed.
Yeah, it throws up several questions, but I'll ask one after the other. One is, I'm trying to get my head around the Chinese action in Galwan. What are they trying to do? Is it part of their sort of salami slicing strategy, or what exactly prompted it?
We say that now in hindsight, it appears that first of all, they have exploited a tactical situation, which they had been monitoring clearly. And my sense is that the Indian Army, because of the COVID, the pandemic, some of the annual deployments, exercises which they normally do in that part of the LAC and at this time of the year, were not as per schedule. So as I said earlier, the tactical presence was a bit thin. So having seen the opportunity, China seized it, but it was again a breach of the trust that had existed in the past. And the summary is that in that area, in Ladakh, in Galwan, China had reason to try and improve its own tactical position by coming onto the Indian side, because there are 2-3 Indian, what we call as assets, that have been developed over the years. One is Daulat Beg Oldi, which is the equivalent of airstrip. If you look at the map, you'll have an idea where it is located. And India has been trying to improve the connectivity towards DBO, as they call it. This would pose a certain tactical challenge if there is any kind of an operation that has to be undertaken. And the conjecture is that China wanted to foil that and concurrently prevent India from having any access to areas that it deems to be critical for its own larger strategic understanding of the region. These relate to both Aksai Chin. Again, if you see the map, you'll have an understanding where Aksai Chin is. And China's need to have unfettered access, prevent India from doing anything in that area. And then it moves on into the Xinjiang, Tibet kind of areas. So there is strategic geography here that one has to try and understand. And China perhaps wanted to preempt India and also improve its own position. So this is what they have done. And if you are able to read the map very carefully and the topography, there is a deja vu of 1962, October 1962, and what happened at that particular point in time in the same sector.
Right.
So that is hiding the geography. So
right.
What China has done, as I said, conjecture, and if you dot the I's and cross the T's, it is to seize this particular opportunity and move ahead, fortify itself, and then seek some kind of talks or negotiations. And then it's that old adage that China would take the equivalent of 3 steps forward,
right.
1 step backwards, and then say, this is where the new line is.
Right.
And this is not very different from the kind of, creeping assertiveness that we have seen in the maritime domain in relation to the South China Sea, where you invoke a historical claim, the 9-dash line in that case, and then say that this is cast in stone and it is Chinese history and it is immutable. And then you move ahead and create those artificial islands, improve your position, bring in your air assets, and then slowly intimidate the neighbors by using your military capability. So there is a pattern, I think, in how China is trying to safeguard what it deems to be its own territoriality.
Is it part of its old thinking of being in a perpetually expansionist mode? Because they see themselves sort of as the center of the world, and expansion is always on the cards. It's a long time frame, maybe 1,000 years, for instance. They don't see themselves in terms of short term the way a lot of countries, including America, does. Do you think there is any substance to that kind of thinking?
Well, as someone who's been a student of Chinese thinking, Chinese strategic culture, my own reading is that you don't have to wait 1,000 years. I think President Xi Jinping is fairly keen and determined that 2049, which is 100 years of communist China, 1949 to 2049, is the year that has been identified when China would restore itself to the kind of past glory and the position that it believes it enjoyed as the Middle Kingdom. And that all other states and tribes, if you will, would have to accept a subservient position and acknowledge and pay tribute to the Chinese emperor, quote unquote.
Right.
My sense is that there is an attempt to reclaim that kind of a primacy. And in this schema, territoriality, I think, becomes a very important adjunct. So you will find much of Chinese literature talking about the motherland and the need for unification. Right. And right on top of the list, of course, is Taiwan, which is why whenever there is a reference to Taiwan, you find that almost without exception, every Chinese leader makes it very clear that there is no negotiation on Taiwan. It has to come back, which is why the one China policy, various things that they have attempted. But the reality is that despite all the rhetoric, today we have a democratic Taiwan, which is, I think, fairly clear about its own identity. And after the Hong Kong experience, I think even the more discerning people in the Chinese leadership are aware that the unification of Taiwan with the mainland is not a given. And there are going to be many challenges ahead. And therefore, that is one anxiety that is now deep-seated.
Right.
The other, of course, is Tibet. Now, as recently as last week, if you remember, President Xi Jinping made a very important speech in relation to Tibet. And he talks about converting Tibet into an impregnable fort, quote unquote. And very interestingly, there is reference to Sinicizing Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. Now that is loaded. If you are a student of, different schools of Buddhist practice, the idea that after 70 years, China now is in a position where it has to impose, intimidate, and Sinicize Tibetan Buddhism, it would suggest that they have not made any progress in the ideological, ideational domain as far as Tibet is concerned. Therefore, use more force, use more intimidation, convert Tibet into a Xinjiang. I'm just raising these possibilities.
Right.
So that, to my mind, is another anxiety that both Taiwan and Tibet, which represent two different aspects of the unfinished agenda for China in terms of the unification of the motherland. I imagine that all this is playing out, and even in relation to India, there are various, shall we say, schools of thought, and historically about Mao Zedong, the five fingers, the palm, and how that whole description of the Indian Northeast has been, alluded to in Chinese political discourse. But this is my reading at this point in time, that we are not very sure as to how China is going to respond to India particularly, in terms of the LAC. And the Indian resolve now to say that we expect China to go back to the status quo that existed before Galwan.
I was asking in the specific context of the Dalai Lama and the fact that mortality is always around the corner. And once he's gone, does China have any pretense left to even discuss Tibet, which they are not doing at this stage either? So what happens post Dalai Lama? So we were talking about the Dalai Lama as a factor, if at all it's any longer. I don't think so personally. Although he continues to have a huge emotional, sentimental appeal for the Tibetans. And as you mentioned, China is still not able to co-opt Buddhism into Sinicization project. How do you see the whole thing?
Well, like you said, I think there is a huge, emotional kind of reverence for the Dalai Lama himself. And that is both, I would say, in Tibet, outside Tibet, globally. And what would happen, I think, in a post-Dalai Lama context is something which is very, very opaque now. I'm not sure that anybody has a firm grip on it, because much would depend on what kind of an emotional / spiritual response is likely to be triggered. And here, I think the numbers would matter. both within Tibet and outside Tibet. And what is it that China would seek to do in terms of filling that particular position with somebody who they may like to? It's a bit like saying that what they did in Hong Kong,
Right.
that after having dealt with the protests, you have in place a team that is going to be more empathetic and perhaps even subservient to what Beijing expects of them. Would they be able to do it? That is the question mark, because if the president of China has to make such an assertive speech, and we are aware that there's been a lot of what you might call as coercion in Tibet over the years, it's also true that they have managed to introduce a certain amount of development for the local people, because one has come across, many views there about what China has been able to do. There's a whole 2 generations that have been born after the Dalai Lama fled Tibet and came to India.
Right.
So there is a demographic change also that has taken place. But with every new demography, Gen Next, whether it's in Tibet or it's in mainland China, their responses to an upheaval or to an event that has an emotional or, in this case, spiritual resonance, I think it's very, very difficult, for any, any kind of group in power to be able to anticipate and deal with it. That, I think, is the slippery part. And as of now, I'm sure China would be doing some planning about the post-Dalai Lama exigency, but I see it as one which is fraught with certain uncertainties.
Right. Just to complete the Tibetan thought, I've always viewed that it's essentially a battle of attrition, because China can wait out a single individual's lifetime without any problems at all. On the other hand, the Dalai Lama is a single individual with very finite lifetime. So that's their game. They'll just wait it out. When he passes, they'll impose whatever they want to impose, including their own Dalai Lama, I presume. So I don't know if Tibet any longer remains a significant trump card for India at all, in any sense of the word.
No, I don't think India ever saw it as a trump card. There are, of course, many views in India about Tibet. But if one goes back to the kind of positions that the government of India has taken, from the time of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru to where we are now, I don't think there has been any suggestion that we are going to go back. I have not heard any serious kind of discussion. There are allusions. For instance, recently, after this whole Galwan incident, there was some talk that in Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri's time, there was some talk about this. But as I said, as an analyst, right, I'd be a little cautious, before accepting. I think China has obtained that commitment from India about the fact that Tibet, and from Jawaharlal Nehru through Narasimha Rao to Vajpayee, the wording has also been tweaked in a manner to accommodate China's sensitivities and anxieties about suzerainty and sovereignty. And if you read that fine print very carefully, you'll know what I'm talking about. So I think India has gone the extra mile to assuage China's concerns about Tibet. And therefore, the suggestion that we are certainly going to pull this out as a trump card, I think is perhaps overinterpreted.
Okay. To come to the more immediate development in terms of the likely Moscow meeting, since it's happening in Moscow and China and Russia have warmed up in recent years, do you think Moscow might choose to play even an indirect, subtle role in this?
Well, I think Moscow is not a stranger, to mediation or some kind of encouragement to move towards talks and peace. After all, they did this in Tashkent, if you remember.
Right.
And Moscow was a very important interlocutor for India during the 1971 war for Bangladesh. So to that extent, Moscow has a certain, I would say, history in terms of how it has dealt with Delhi whenever Delhi has been in such situations. I think from a strategic point of view, many years ago, I remember we met Mr. Primakov when he was not the Prime Minister. He had come to our institute. That's how I had a chance to meet him. And we spoke at length. He was a very affable at that time as Professor Primakov. And he had outlined the triangle, the Primakov triangle as it is called, which is Russia, India, China. So I think there is a certain, I would say, underlying objective for Russia to try and see whether there could be a certain degree of, I would say, amity, if you will, between these three powers. Now, the Russia-China relationship has its own, I would say, traction, its own orientation, and it's a more deep relationship, in terms of the origins. The genealogy of Russia and China go back to the Soviet days and the way in which the former Soviet Union had mentored communist China in those early decades. But I think now, given the fact that Russia's own economy has become much smaller than that of China, it's also incidentally smaller than that of India. But this in no way, detracts from China's own position as a major power. That is because of its military capability and the very deft kind of game of chess at the strategic level that President Putin has been playing. So my sense is that since India is also a very important interlocutor for them, in terms of managing their relationship with China, right, because they do not want to become the equivalent of a junior partner as China moves towards its 2049 aspiration. So there, I think India has a certain relevance. And therefore, having an India and China in terms of their own relationship that has not hit the, what you might call a tripwire of hostilities in such a manner that India would be encouraged to move towards the United States for whatever it may be seeking from the US. I think that's not an exigency that is favorable from the Russian perspective either. So retaining India in a certain, space is something that would be in the larger Russian interest. And my sense is that some of this would be at play in the current SCO deliberations, which Russia is sherping at this point in time.
The last question about China. As recently as today, the Foreign Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, has spoken in terms of him taking a long-term view of this conflict, and he insists that the only way out is to make an accommodation between the two countries. If that is the case, what kind of an accommodation do you think can be made from both sides so that there is a de-escalation of this most intense tension since 1962?
Well, my reading is that from the Indian side, the Galwan experience has perhaps been internalized, and India would like some kind of resolution of this territorial dispute, because from the Chinese side, a few weeks ago, the Chinese ambassador in India made the statement saying that this problem can't be solved in a hurry. So let it, in a way, continue in this unresolved manner. I think that's not desirable from the Indian point of view, because then we will see more of this creeping assertiveness. At this point in time, the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is still, in its early stages. There is a China-Pakistan economic corridor.
Right.
Now, if China's ambitions become more grand, if you will, there would be a temptation to alter geography again. We are not quite sure which way they want to, but China has many options. So therefore, I think the quicker this LAC is agreed to and has the beginnings of an agreed boundary between both sides, I think it would lead to the kind of long-term equipoise between the two Asian giants, which is highly desirable.
Right.
And I think that's where India would like to sort of take this particular bilateral to, and that where we are now is to encourage China to also look at the Indian interest and see what kind of accommodation is possible, in which case I think the give and take could be considered. I mean, there were various packages. China had made a proposal during Chavan last time. And subsequently, that was at the time of Sikkim, when China had accepted Sikkim as part of India. There was also a sense that they would be willing to accept Arunachal Sikkim. And as long as there is no inhabited area, some give and take for purposes of topography could be considered. And these were when the situation of the relationship was more malleable, was more conducive. Right. I don't know if that obtains now, but I think that is where we should be looking for a political accommodation of a very complex territorial dispute whose origins go back to pre-colonial times, actually.
Right.
It's not even of recent origin. It goes back to the 18th, 19th centuries.
Right. Do you think it's wise for any Indian government to generally treat China as permanent menace in varying degrees. The degree changes, but the fact of menace remains all the time.
I think China has always been seen as the equivalent of a challenge for India. The experience of October 1962, I think, runs very deep. It's part of the Indian collective memory. And China's actions have not been very conducive to engender or increase the trust, because in recent decades, particularly the covert cooperation with Pakistan, the assistance on nuclear weapons, missiles, and in a way encouraging, allowing Pakistan to invest in terror, and all the other actions that China has taken, whether it is the nuclear suppliers group, there's been a certain degree of duplicity about how China has dealt with India. Whereas India, I think, has been more trusting, hoping that China would accept or realize that a harmonious relationship with India is in its own interest. Now, all normative logic would say that this is the case. But China, for whatever reason, does not seem to accept that logic, and they expect a subservient India. And that old adage that China seeks the equivalent of a multipolar world, or if anything, maybe a bipolar world with the United States.
Right.
But when it comes to Asia, it wants a unipolar Asia, right. And that neither Japan nor India would be given any space unless they accept the kind of subordinate relationship to China, which I don't think Japan and China are going to accept in a hurry. So this is the catch-22. But I would say India has been still more, in a way, optimistic in terms of its investment in China. Whether or not China recognizes this, I think, is part of this very opaque strategic culture of China, where they want to project themselves in a certain way. They have a self-image of China as a just and harmonious country, but their actions, I'm afraid, do not harmonize with the self-image.
Slightly more political question, and I think it's about the narrative that has taken hold in India, especially in the context of Prime Minister Nehru. If 1962 was his albatross, why is Galwan not the same thing for Prime Minister Modi?
Well, I would say, that's a very, I think, sharp question that you're raising, but the possibility exists, meaning that the ignominy of 1962 is something that Jawaharlal Nehru carried till the very end, till his demise in May 1964. Now, many historians and those who have studied that particular phase of Pandit Nehru say that, it shattered him for a variety of reasons. We don't have to get into Krishna Menon and all of that. But for Prime Minister Modi, while it may not be of the same magnitude yet, I think he had invested in China, for instance, personally, in terms of Wuhan, as also Mahabalipuram. And he tried to convey that a degree of personal diplomacy would be able to make the difference. And you saw this, I'm sure, Mayank, you as a person who's son of the soil, you saw the Gujarat visit.
Yeah.
When President Xi Jinping had been invited. And you saw that famous Jhula, visual. So there was a sense that Prime Minister Modi was, of a certain conviction that his personal relationship with President Xi Jinping would alter the texture or the kind of brittleness in the India-China relationship. That has been belied.
Right.
Now, as and when history revisits Prime Minister Modi's own tenure in the second term, I think Galwan would stand out as a place where India did have a setback. Now, whether or not India would be able to achieve or realize the political objective, which India at the MEA, Dr. Jaishankar have repeatedly stated, is that we want China to go back to the status quo. Now, that's a work in progress.
Right.
Rajnath Singh's visit to Moscow is part of that work in progress. Now, whether or not there would be another meeting at the foreign minister's level is at the point speculative. But I think the Galwan chapter would be a significant part of Modi 2.0, whichever way it is resolved.
Okay. And finally, I wanted to dwell a bit more, but I'll just keep it to one question on this. With the US practically retreating in the last 3.5 years under the Trump administration from a lot of world affairs, the way it used to be involved in. How do you see China reading that? Do you think China reads that as its opportunity, maybe an early opportunity for it to establish even greater primacy now?
The short answer is yes. I think China did see an opportunity in 2007-8 when we had the global economic financial crisis. And China did occupy a certain amount of space there. And more recently, of course, the pandemic has raised a number of questions about China and its own profile as a responsible power. But I think it does see an opportunity, and the BRI and the way it's been packaged is being seen as an example to say that China can now be the equivalent of the Asian kind of Marshall Plan variant and replace the United States. But there haven't been too many takers as yet for it. But I think in terms of the wish list, China does see itself as a country that would like to now be seen as definitely a peer of the US, and maybe in the decades ahead be seen as the number one power, and that it will become the rule taker. I beg your pardon, it will be the rule maker.
Right.
At the moment, it has been chafing under the fact that it was a rule taker for the 80s, the 90s, until recently. In July 2016, in relation to the South China Sea, China decided it will become a rule breaker.
Right.
It rejected the ICJ and all of that. So I think now the transition is from rule breaker. Can I become rule maker and ensure that the rest of the global community would accept their positions as rule takers of what China is going to, in a way, I think, outline. That, to my mind, in a nutshell, is the challenge for China and the world.
Yeah. Just as some levity, you mentioned a possible Chinese Marshall Plan. To me, it seems more like a debt trap plan, the way China operates.
I agree.
Money as a means of debt trap.
Well, ask the Pakistanis, as they would say, they have a bitter experience now of what they're going through.
Right. Ask anyone, Africa or even Sri Lanka.
Yeah.